Well, I wanted to continue discussing leadership and the relationship of love to leadership, and we could really go and go and go in this. I think this might be the last session we do just directly speaking on love, and we might move on to some other things like the faithfulness of a leader, then get into some real practical principles from the life of the Apostle Paul. But I wanted to look this morning and just talk about the motivation of leadership as Christians. And again, we're talking about Christians in leadership. Our concern is Christian leadership, right? Our concern isn't just general leadership as you might see it in different spheres of life. We want, as Christians, we want to lead as Christ led, right? And so we've been looking at what are the necessary components of being a Christian leader. And we saw you've got to establish a relationship with the greatest leader, the character of a Christian leader, the convictions, the worldview, the narrative, the love we saw last time. And what I want to look at next time, at least for part of our time, I was thinking about doing it today, but I thought it might kind of detract from our topic today. But I want us to look at the example of a biblical leader, and specifically Joshua. And Joshua, if you want a picture of leadership and biblical Christian leadership, Joshua is one of the most phenomenal leaders you can find in Scripture. You have guys like Moses, David, Nehemiah, Paul, certainly Christ, and we're going to talk a lot about Christ's leadership. But if you go to the Old Testament, you see a lot of these principles that we're discussing lived out in the life of Joshua. And so I want to go through that next week and just kind of see all that we've been talking about come to life in the example of Joshua, that great leader. But today I want to talk about the motivation of Christian leadership. And again, I'm really piggybacking a lot on Alexander Strauch's book, Leading with Love. Do any of you guys have this book? Okay. Any book that Alexander Strauch writes is worth getting, because he's to the point, easy to understand, quick read. It's not gonna, you're not gonna have a 50-page chapter you have to dig through, with all these difficult terminology. So that's been super helpful for me in this study. I'm kind of following his little outline for that. But if you think about motivation, let's think about motivation for leadership. What motivates people to lead? What are some things that, apart from just specifically Christian leadership, what are some motivations that people have to be in leadership positions? Whether it's a CEO of a company, whether it's to lead your family, to lead your employees, to lead your friends. What are some motivations that drive people in their leadership?
Goal.
Okay, a certain idea or a goal. Do you have what comes to your mind? Did you have an example of that? People are
Maybe also to improve, because
okay.
they bring on board a new CEO, they improve the company's finances.
Okay.
Like that. So I guess
so improve productivity, improve financial status. If you have a big idea that you want to implement, and so you try to get other people who jump on board with that big idea, whether it's water conservation, whether it's depolluting the earth, whether it's social problems, whether it's financial, but you have this idea and you want other people to get around you to accomplish that idea. Any other motivations that you can find to lead?
My experience in the military, a lot of it is character. It goes a lot with the person's character. And we find a lot of soldiers that are shy, and you just kind of throw them in the pool so they can start swimming, and you put them in situations where you're gonna teach the subject. So find everything that you need to about it and research it, because you're going to present it to a bunch of captains and colonels and sergeants and higher ranking personnel.
Right.
And it's kind of like, and so you develop that character. A lot of folks are just naturally born leaders, and they just want to take that role, and they want to, it's character.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you think about it, we've named a lot of them, but the motivation for people to lead others, you think about how often people want to be in a position of leadership, and you say, why? Well, oftentimes it's for success, right? They want personal success. The leader gets credit. Now the leader also gets the blame, right? But if you think about people, why they want to be in positions of leadership, oftentimes they're driven by a desire for success, personal ambition, to be the top of the ladder, right? I want to rise to the top in this company. People often are paid more in leadership when you think about the business world, right? So oftentimes we have leadership driven by, motivated by financial status, gaining more. How about this? Leaders feel in charge, right? So oftentimes people want to be in a position of leadership so that they have power over other people, so they can tell people what to do.
I've personally noticed that, women that get into that, like, they have the tendency to have like a power trip. I mean, just because I work in the nursing field and I have had a lot of them.
Yeah.
It just seems like, it seems unnatural kind of.
Yeah, so there's this, it almost inflates, and I think we've all experienced that to some degree or another, whatever field it's in, but where what do we say, power corrupts, or what do we say, they're on a power trip, right? And you feel this person really loves the fact that they're in control.
Yeah.
Even if it's somebody like scanning you as you go into a middle school, and they're like bossing you around, and you're like, all right, like,
but it seems
relax.
to be the women more than the men that get that kind of feel. I don't know. That's just been my
In your
experience.
There's a reason behind that. It's
Yeah.
just, they're empowered, but when you're empowered, a big responsibility comes with it, because you have to understand where that power comes from and knowing how to control yourself.
Right.
And a lot of folks, and I experienced this in the military, you give them folks, you promote them or you give them power, and they just run wild with it,
Right.
and then they just start belittling people, and they start,
Right.
because they're empowered now.
Yeah.
And so it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
In the military.
Yeah, I know it. I don't know exactly. I wouldn't know exactly. How that would relate to women specifically versus men, because in my personal experience, it's often been a lot of men who have that power trip. So I think it could have to do with the field we're in.
Yeah.
Yes.
But you think about the leadership. I've known women who are leaders who have exercised that leadership the way we'll look at today, like my mother.
Yeah.
My mother's a leader.
Right.
In a lot of, not just as a mother, but also in her nonprofit that she's leading, in the business world, in the music world. So I think that the area of business you're in, you're feeling that heavily. But I think that's a component of leadership that, when not driven by the right motivation, we experience exactly that. And there might be different elements of it and different, but you think when you're a leader, people listen to you. People do what you say. And we say, well, power corrupts. Well, not really, but power just gives the opportunity for that corruption to express itself, right? The power itself doesn't do anything. Jesus had all the power in the world, in the universe. He wasn't corrupted by it. So power or leadership really exposes what's inside. It's not the corrupting influence. It just gives that evil inside opportunity to exercise itself, right?
Makes sense.
If you're an arrogant, belittling, looking down on others, but nobody listens to you or cares what you say, then you just don't have opportunity to exercise your belittling. And everything you say, nobody's belittled by it, because they say, who are you? But if you're in a position of power and you act that way, then you can exercise it. The power hasn't done anything to corrupt you, right?
Ready for it.
So if you look at the motivation, leaders feel in charge, superior, powerful, and there are many motivations for people to lead. But at the core of this, if you think about these that we've been discussing, these are selfish motivations at the root of them. The leader is motivated by something for themselves, whether it's recognition, reputation, fame, power, feeling in charge, a sense of completion, a sense of success, a sense of respect, a sense of accomplishment. They're motivated by something for themselves. And this is antithetical to the very heart of the gospel. Right? Let's go to 2 Corinthians 5 just for a moment. I want to show and we know this, but we really need to understand just how vast this is The gospel is not just a message of give up your drunkenness, give up your immorality, give up your whatever for Jesus and come. It's die to self. That's what the gospel is. Die to self. So people who are living for themselves, one might express that murdering people. And everybody goes, he needs Jesus, right? We have those t-shirts. You need Jesus. Look at that guy. Or, the person who's just grumpy. They need Jesus. But then we see the self-righteous person who's trusting in their own works, but they're a good neighbor. They give to charities. They're philanthropic. They're kind. And we say, they're great. They don't need Jesus. Because look how good they are. Well, the biblical understanding of man's depravity is that in our sinful condition, every person is living inherently for themselves, regardless of how that expresses itself. They're living selfishly, and the gospel puts that to death. Look at what he says in verse 14 of 2 Corinthians 5. For the love of Christ controls us, and we're going to look at this again in a minute, because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. How have they died? And he, Jesus, died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. The death you die is a death to self. And now the life you live is a life lived for Jesus. And we're going to look at this and examine this, but this is why Jesus says, whoever loves father, mother, son, or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. What he's saying is, if you love yourself more than me, and those who serve you and those who you love in your circle, if you love, in fact, anything more than me, you're not worthy of me. So when somebody's saved, they die to self-love. They die to selfish ambition. They die to the love of everything else over Christ. And now they live a life for Jesus. And so the Christian leader is not motivated by selfish ambition, but there's another motivation driving Christian leadership. I say, you can count on it. If you have selfish motivation in leadership, you will have selfish agendas in leadership. So, if your motivation to be a father is that you feel in charge, you feel like you are in charge and in control, then your motivation is going to show itself in your agenda for your kids. Obey me. Do what I do. And as soon as they are subjected to you in obedience, you check off accomplished success. You have no care for their heart, no care for their well-being, no care for their spiritual well-being, no care for their struggles, no care for how they're doing, right? It's just they obeyed me, I got my obedience, I'm in charge, I spoke, they shut up, I'm good. It's self-motivated agendas. Think about it with your wife. You have a desire for her to respect you. You're the man. Respect me. And so that's what's driving you, motivation to be respected. So as soon as you see the outward signs of respect, she doesn't talk when I talk, or when she walks in the room, I stand up, or whatever you could think of this kind of macho ruling over your wife. The husband's satisfied. She's in her right place. I'm respected. She knows who the boss is. I'm good. No care for her. No care for her spiritual well-being. No care for her relationship with the Lord. No care for her sensitivity to her, right? Same thing with the employees. If your motivation is money, all you're going to care about with your employees is the bottom line. So you drive. This guy's not performing. You don't care why. You cut him. New guy in, right? And we've probably all been victims of that at some point, where we feel like we're being run over, but that he's motivated by the bottom line, and so his leadership agenda is just to get the bottom line. And that's where we see corruption enter, right? They'll cut corners, they'll do things that are unethical, they'll cheat on this, they'll cheat on that, because bottom line's driving them, because their motivation is finances. So innately, all of these things are selfish. And brothers, this is easy for us to do in our leadership. And you think about where we are in leadership. Whatever is driving us is what we're going to pursue. And so if I'm motivated to lead for a love of money, my agenda will be the bottom line. Who cares if I run people over in the process? So the point is, your motivation will determine your leadership. Does that make sense? What's driving you is going to drive how you lead. So, as we think about Christians and Christian leaders, we need to think, okay, obviously all of these motivations are selfish. The gospel calls us to die to self. We don't want to be motivated by selfish ambition, a desire for respectability, love, whatever. What should be driving us? And let me just say this before we get to that. We may look at the world and say, oh yeah, look at the greedy world out there. This is a lot more prevalent than we think. Think about this. The pressure you feel coming to church to perform. I hope this church doesn't have a culture like this. I hope there's a realness where we can fellowship and be ourselves. But what I mean by that is really share life together and share our struggles and wrestlings. But how prevalent is this? The husband understands the expectation of the church. If you're going to be respected and deemed a worthy husband, your kids are going to be in order. They're going to be dressed a certain way. They're going to behave a certain way. They're going to act a certain way towards others when you come to church. So the husband is being motivated by, I want to be seen as a respectable, godly husband in this culture, this church culture. That's what's driving him. So he goes to the wife, you better look like this, act like this, and you better make sure the kids are in line this Sunday. And the wife, being driven by wanting to approve her husband, goes to the kids and says, act up, do this, don't do that, don't you act out. And this trickling down of pressure coming from the top to the father of I've got to be approved here trickles all the way down to the kids, to the 4 and 5-year-olds who are now being pressed into a mold and crushed under this weight of standards that they've got to step up to because dad doesn't want to look bad at church. You see? And so the father, and it creeps in, but 10 years down the line realizes I haven't been training my kids because I love them and I want to win their hearts. I've been training my children to put them in a mold so that Tom and Jane at church will think better of me. And the kids feel that pressure to conform, to look good. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Have you guys experienced anything like that as parents, as husbands, can you relate to that, or have you seen that?
But I wouldn't say necessarily for church, but sometimes, like when you used to have friends come over, you didn't want your kids acting up because you didn't want them to think that you were bad parents.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, not specifically towards how they act at church, but in their social environment or outside, like you better not act up at the church.
Yeah. Now think about what you just said. You don't want your kids to act up because they'll think I'm bad parents. Selfish.
Yep.
That's purely selfish. It's all about me. Kids behave for me. Now, do we want our kids to behave? Yeah. Do we want our kids not to act up? Yeah. But why? Because we care about their soul. Because we want them to see Christ. Because we want them to walk in obedience for their well-being. It's all motivated by what we'll get to in a minute. Love for them and love for the Lord. But you said it. And how much of our leadership is defined that way? Don't do this because I want to be seen this way or perceived this way. That's huge. So the motivation of a Christian leader is there's really only one. Love. Love is the motivation for a Christian leader. Listen to what Alexander Strauch says. Love is the greatest motivating power in the universe. It is at the heart of the gospel. God's love moved him to give his son for our salvation. Love is the indispensable motivating force for all Christian service. And what he does is, and what I want us to do just in our time, is look at the three motivations or the three loves that should motivate us. Okay? So, number one, and you see it there in the outline, Christ's love for us. And if you're still in 2 Corinthians 5, we see it right here. Verse 14. For the love of Christ controls us, because we've concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. Paul says the love of Christ controls us. He's speaking of himself and the other apostles. And note that this isn't the love of Christ, the love he has for Jesus controls him. Now we'll get to that. This produces that. But he's saying the love that Jesus has displayed toward me controls me. And he wanted to communicate. He wanted that love to be understood, felt by others. He wanted to communicate the love of Christ to others. Do you remember Ephesians chapter 3, the prayer he prays at the end of Ephesians 3? He wants them to know the love that surpasses not. Or what does he say? I have it here. Okay, Ephesians 3:14. Oh, he prays this for the Ephesians. For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant you to be strengthened with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may have strength to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Paul wanted the Ephesians and us and the Corinthians to know this love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. He didn't want us to just know about it. He wanted us to intimately be acquainted with it, to experience it, to the point where he says, this love controls me. Literally, that word control, sunakai, it's the idea of being pressed down and forced into action. So water under pressure is very powerful, right? It shoots out. That's what a hose is. That's why a power hose. I went to power hose my house last summer, and it started chipping off the brick on the house, and so I stopped. But it was so powerful. I was like, this looks uglier than the dirt on there. And why is a power hose powerful? Because of pressure, right? It has nowhere to go. So the one little hole that it is given opportunity to go, it shoots through there, and all of this power forcing it out. That's what Paul's communicating with sunakai. The love of Christ presses down upon me. It forces a certain life out of me. And what is that life? Verse 15. That those who live might no longer live for themselves. Christ has loved me with such a powerful love that I'm pressed into this life of not living for myself anymore, but living for Christ selflessly. Yeah.
That's why this week I read Mark 1 through 4, and in Mark 3:31, where Jesus rejects his mother, and I now understand why he rejected her. When if you go to Mark 3, verse 31.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's like he explains at a different level his devotion to God. It's like, who is my mother? Who is my brother? But
Right.
those who,
Right.
who are here, you are.
Yeah.
My mother, you are my father.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a powerful... What he's displaying for us there is there's a greater family than physical blood. There's a greater family than what these human relationships bring. There's a blood that connects us. What do we say? Water's thicker than, or blood is thicker than water. What do we say about friends? We say their blood. I feel like there's a saying I'm missing, but talk about your loved ones. You say their blood. Like I love them more than anything. Their blood. Well, when we enter the realm of Christ, there's a greater blood that connects us, namely the blood of God, the blood of Christ, who was shed for us. So my allegiance, now as Paul's saying in 2 Corinthians 5, my allegiance is to the one who bled for me, even over blood relatives. I'm living for him greater than even for them. Now, that's a whole other topic, but that actually frees us to love them more. But yeah, Paul's being constrained by this love for Christ that is pressing him into action. Did you have any other thoughts on that?
It makes sense why he rejected.
Yeah.
I mean, how here in Corinthians, like, okay, that's why he rejected. It's like Paul is referring to his love for Jesus and his devotion.
Yeah.
Jesus is explaining his
devotion
to God, his devotion to God.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first motivating factor in our leadership needs to be the love that Christ has displayed toward us. This love ought to press us into action. And we see it in Paul's life. Paul couldn't do nothing. That's why Paul was a faithful ambassador. If you go through 2 Corinthians 5 and you see the leadership of Paul being an ambassador for Christ, he's imploring people to come to Christ. He's begging them, be reconciled to God. This led Paul to do something because he was moved by how much Christ loved him. I say, if for you and me, if we know this love of Christ toward us, we must respond. This love demands something. And remember Isaac Watts' hymn, love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Lou, welcome. I heard you had a successful day at work. Praise God. I want to read to you from pages 28 and 29 of this book. What Strauch does is he gives us several examples and quotes from men in the past who've been motivated to action by Christ's love. And I just thought, man, he can say it better than I can say it. So I want to read this here. Listen to this. History provides many examples of leaders and teachers who tell of the motivating power of the love of Christ. Methodist preacher and pastor William Alfred Quayle, for example, recorded a conversation he had with a horseback-riding frontier preacher to the North American settlers during the 1800s. The pioneering missionary said to Quayle, I feel the woes of the heathen. I know the bitter barrenness of their lives, but this would not suffice to keep me among them. One gets used to heathenism and grows callous to its desperate tragedy. Not the love of man sufficeth to keep me away from my wife and from my children through these years. Only the love of Christ is competent. You know what he's saying? He says, it's not the love I have just purely for the heathen to go amongst them and sacrifice myself. You get used to that. You know, you go to a place, a third world country, and you see the poor, you see the sick, and you say, I've got to come here and serve. Well, go there for 6 months, and it just becomes normal. Mm-hmm. And that compassion can just fall away. He says, only the love of Christ is competent to keep me here. Yeah. Ian Murray tells us it was the realization of Christ's love that influenced renowned preacher Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones to leave his prestigious medical career to preach God's word. Ian Murray says, he came to see the love of God expressed in the death of Christ in a way which overwhelmed him. Everything which was happening to him in his new spiritual life was occurring because of what had first happened to Christ. Hope MacDonald, missionary to Brazil, describes her realization of God's love. I saw for the first time the ancient truth, we love him because he first loved us. How had I overlooked it? I had memorized that verse before I started school. As the reality of his love for me engulfed me for the first time, I wanted to get out of bed and jump for joy. I wanted to climb to the top of the roof and shout to the world, wake up, God loves me. It was a moment I will never forget. Since then, I've never doubted his love for me. And Hudson Taylor, the final example he gives, founder of the China Inland Mission. believed that if money, now listen to this, if money could motivate the merchants of England to cross life-threatening oceans and enter the interior of China at great personal risk of loss of life, could not the love of Christ motivate missionaries to do the same for the sake of the gospel? The great truth, writes Strauch, we must come to again and again throughout life is this, not that we love God, but that he first loved us and demonstrated his love by sending his only Son into the world to be the propitiation for our sins. This is what should most thrill our hearts and motivate us to serve others. Does that make sense? So, our number one motivation is that Jesus Christ came to serve us. We then need to serve others because his love constrains us. It presses us to do something. A Christian who wants to just receive God's love and do nothing to express that love to others is not a Christian. I would challenge you and say, I don't think you've experienced the love of Christ. Because the nature of the love of Christ is a sunaikai. It's a pressing love. It's a love that is pressing down upon you with such weight that it forces you to act on it. Does that make sense? So, motivation number one. Any thoughts on that or any questions or anything? Okay, let's move on to number two. So that's motivation number one, love of Christ displayed and continues to be displayed toward us. But this then creates something in our souls, another dimension of love. Secondly, it creates our love for Christ, right? 1 John 4:19, we love because he first loved us. So this love he's demonstrated to us immediately creates in us a love for him. It's kind of like a stranger. Now, this is on a small, insignificant scale, but let's say somebody comes up to me and they put a gun to my head, and as they pull the trigger, Luis jumps in front of me. And before this time, Luis is a total stranger to me. Just walking down the street, he jumps in front of me, he takes the bullet from me. And the guy who shot me runs off, and there lies Luis dead. Immediately, I don't go, what a loser. This guy didn't even know me. What's he doing? Right? Immediately, I'm overwhelmed by his love for me. A complete stranger gave his life for me. And the affection and depth of love you would have toward that individual would be overwhelming, wouldn't it? And you'd be rattling your brain for the rest of your life. Why did he do that? I don't get it. And you'd tell people, and you'd ask them, why do you think this guy did that? They'd say, well, I don't know. Maybe are you sure you didn't know him? Yeah, I don't know him. Maybe he was a Christian. Like, people would be trying to figure out, why did he do that? And you'd go, I don't know why he did that, but you'd love him, wouldn't you? And then you'd see his wife and kids that he left. Wouldn't you just embrace them and love them? So that's pales in significance, right? Christ loves you to die for you. And immediately produce in your soul is an overwhelming love for him. That's why I ask people, I don't want to, if somebody wants to talk to me about being a member of the church or wants to know if they're saved, I don't ask them, hey, do you check off is God 3 in 1? You believe in the Trinity? Okay. Believe by grace through faith alone? Okay. Well, welcome. You're a Christian. You know what I want to know from people? And I can't tell this infallibly, but know what I want to know? Same thing when people come to me as a pastor and they're struggling. They're saying, I don't think I'm a Christian. And I say, why? And they give their reasons, right? You know what I ask them? Do you love Jesus? Yes, I love Jesus, but look, I can't be, I fail here, I fail there. I want to know, do you love Jesus Christ? If you don't have love for Christ, you can tick off all the orthodox boxes you want. You could give your body to be burned. Remember we saw that last time? I want to know, do you love him? Not, did you have a great week and you're really beating that sin this week? I want to know, do you love Jesus? And you know what people who are struggling with assurance instinctively will say? Yes, I love Christ, but... Okay. The love that's produced in your heart, and that love is demonstrated in our life, right? A lot of people could say, oh yeah, I love Jesus, but their life shows they don't love Jesus. Kind of like the guy who says he loves his wife and then cheats on her. Doesn't mean anything. Literally means nothing. And she says, but he says he loves me. And I go, really? It's demonstrated by the life. But we're driven. I wrote this. Sometimes it's better to stick to my notes. He creates within us a love for him. He becomes, and Strauch says, the supreme object of our affections. The supreme object of our affections. The Cowboys go to third. Family goes to second. That new car you got goes to fifth. Your job and money goes to sixth. He becomes the supreme object of your affections. Not one of, the supreme object of your affections. He becomes our all in all. Remember that song? He is my all in all. Shouldn't sing. And how couldn't he be the supreme object of our affections? That's the question. Not how do we make him the supreme object? My question is, how couldn't he be the supreme object? Somebody asked me recently, my neighbor, how do you love Christ so much? How is he so precious to you? You know what my response? How couldn't he be so precious to me? He drank hell for me and gave me heaven. And you've got to ask, how does he become precious? For those of us who are married, have you ever had those moments where you just had pure ecstasy of joy with your wife? And you just look at her, and I've had this, and often, and it's like words just can't express. It's like when you see like a little puppy and you want to like squeeze it to death, right? And you're just like, you just can't express it. And you look at your wife and you see her inner beauty and her outer beauty and her love and her care. And for me, I want to be like my wife. I look up to my wife. And there are times I'm just overwhelmed by, everything in me loves her. And if somebody were to come up to me and go, man, how do you manage to love her? Be like, are you crazy? Look at her. Live with her for a day. Get to know her. How couldn't you love her?
Yeah, it seems like the example of your neighbor is like he's not understanding that aspect of everything. Instead, it seems like, because this is my mentality too, like you doing this is, why are you doing this instead of this? Like, why are you not having fun at the, whatever, doing all these, things that I used to love to do, versus like you got to be clean, you got to,
right.
go to church, read your Bible.
Right.
Like that's more probably the mentality your neighbor's having, like not
right.
the relationship aspect.
Right. And where I took him was the treasure in the field.
Yeah.
Christ is the treasure in the field. That's why Christianity is not an outward pressing mold onto the person. It's an inward spring flowing out. So unbelievers feel this press. Do this, do this, do this. You don't want to go to hell, do you? Do this, do this. Right. And they go, okay, I've got to act like this. I got to do this. I got to do this. And they're feeling pressed. When Christ saves us, what's born inside of us is from the outside or from the inside out an overwhelming love and affection for him. Now I want to love him. I want to serve him. I want to live for him. Where else would I want to be on a Sunday morning than with the corporate gathering of the saints where he is in his special presence to bring honor and glory to him? It's all coming out, not coming from outside of us. So the second motivation is our love for Christ, which is born from his love for me. And I write here, in fact, if we do love anything else other than Christ, we're not worthy of Christ. Whoever loves father, mother, son, or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Now think of it. If our motivation to lead is out of love for Christ, our leadership will be honoring and pleasing to Christ. See that? If our motivation is to love Christ, how we lead will please Christ. And thus it'll be a spirit-empowered, God-honoring, Christ-exalting leader who will have the most success as a Christian leader. Because you're doing it for the glory of God. Therefore, it's pleasing to God. Therefore, his Spirit comes alongside and aids you and gives you success. Leading for leadership's sake does not do anyone any good. Even if it's the greatest leader in the world with the most dynamic capabilities, the best speaking gifts, the best strategies and implementation strategy and all this stuff, if they're leading for selfish ambition, it will fall flat in terms of Christian leadership. How it honors God, how it serves others. However, now this is important. On the other hand, if there is a leader who is not as capable, who is less skilled, less savvy, less knowledgeable, but they are driven by their love for Christ and desire with their whole being to serve and honor him, that will be a leader who will produce good amongst God's people because it'll be blessed by the Lord. Do you see? There have been so many churches led by men, dynamic speakers, brilliant minds, great strategists. They're wonderful leaders in terms of their equipment. And they're driven not by a love for Christ. God doesn't bless it. The Spirit doesn't help it. So they're sitting there going, why isn't this working? People are frustrated. There's infighting. There's division. And they've got the best leader they could possibly find. There have been other churches where there's a man who's kind of an introvert. He didn't go to business grad school. He doesn't have all the strategies for growth. He doesn't know. But he loves Christ. And he's pressed by his love for Christ to serve others as Christ served him. And the church flourishes and grows. And same thing with families. You think about it as a dad. You're the great dad. You've read all the books. You've got all the stuff. You know what to do. You know all the answers. You're not motivated by love for Christ. You have selfish ambition. As opposed to the dad who didn't know how to be a dad. He hasn't read the books. He hardly has a 6th grade education. He doesn't even know hardly how to read. His kids are smarter than him by the time they reach 7th grade. But he loves Jesus. And he's seeking to lay down his life selflessly to serve them. Does that make sense? And the Lord blesses and honors that. Now, I'm not saying skills and leadership capabilities are wrong or unnecessary. We should seek to develop those, right? We want to become better at strategy and better with understanding people and how to lead people. But above all that, love for Christ is paramount. And I say this, you will not be the perfect father, the perfect husband, etc. But do those who you are leading have an example to follow of a man who dearly loves his Savior? Does your love for Christ draw those whom you lead toward Christ, where they say, I want to love Jesus like Dad loves Jesus, like my boss loves Jesus, like that person. And they're drawn to it. Or are they pushed away from Christ because of your leadership? Stroud points out, he gives a great quote about Amy Carmichael. Amy Carmichael lived such a life of love. Listen, this is said of her. The love of God within her was so powerful a magnet that all through her life, she was serving in India, others were drawn irresistibly to her. It was little wonder that the Hindus began to call her, listen to this, the child-catching Missy Amal. And they truly believed that she used some mysterious powder which drugged their children and made them long to be near her. The Hindus thought she was like this witch doctor who was the child catcher, right? Because all these kids were like magnets drawn to her. What was that? It was she was so knew the love of Christ that she loved Christ back and was pressed into service as Christ served. They wanted to be around her. I've known that kind of leadership in my life where people, I could name off pastors. I could name off my father, my mother. They love like this and they serve like this. And you can't wait to be around them. You want to be, right? And you're like drawn to that. And you say, I want to be like that. I can't tell you, I've prayed for years for God just to make me a man like my dad. Because I look at him and I say, I'm drawn to that. And my dad's, you could name tons of, my dad's not the greatest this, my dad's not the great, he's not writing bestseller books, he's not this or that. That man, I want to be just like my dad. And men are drawn to him. Can't tell you how many men have come up to me and said, your dad, man. I say, yeah, I know. But it's because he's been pressed by the love of Christ toward him, that his love for Christ demands something of him. It's not optional for my dad to serve, for my mother to serve, to give their life. Do you see what I'm saying? Maybe I'm being redundant. Does that make sense? Let's look at the last motivation here. Oh, you know what? Let me just read Matthew 22 about love for Christ. One of them, a lawyer, came to Jesus and asked him a question to test him. This is Matthew 22. Maybe I didn't write it down, did I? Oh, that's going to be, that's what we're going to get to in a second. This is the first part. Verse 26. Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law? And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. So, love God. It's the reciprocation of his love for you. But this, thirdly, leads to our love then for people. And this is the third motivation of the leader. And this is verse 39. And a second is like it, Christ said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So, Jesus Christ says there's got to be another motivation of love for others. And this flows out of our love for Christ, our love for God. And we see this, if you go to John 13, this is probably one of the most powerful examples that we have of this. And we won't read the whole thing just for time's sake, but this is where Jesus, he's about to go and be slaughtered for his church. He's about to enter the crucifixion. And his disciples come to eat with him. And he gets down and wipes their feet. And we could go into all what this means theologically, but the point is, the God of the universe. I mean, take off your shoes and your socks right now. I'm going to have a tough time getting down and wiping those stanky feet, right? I mean, that's not a pleasant thing. Now, it was commonplace there because before they would go to a house to eat, they would shower, they'd bathe, so they're clean. And then they'd walk with sandals on the dirt road, and their feet would get dirty. So it's commonplace. You wouldn't go into the person's house and go get another shower or bathe before dinner. You would just have to wipe off your feet. So guess who would do that? You think the master of the house would do that? No, they'd send their little servant, their slave, go wipe off everybody's feet. So there they are. Probably, you could imagine it as a, hey, Luis, what's going on? Hey, welcome, and the person's wiping our feet, and then we just kind of walk on as soon as our feet are done. Probably ignore the person. Mm-hmm. They're just wiping our feet. It's like you don't pay attention to the mat as we do it. You rub your feet off. You're talking, hey, what's up? You rub your feet off real quick and walk in. That's the servant. And Jesus Christ, the God of the universe, takes off his robe, puts on a servant's towel, and bends down and begins to wash his disciples' feet. A lot of theology is packed in there about justification, sanctification, purification, and all this stuff. But the point is, if you look at verse 34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. He's giving us an example to love others. And I just want to say this. He says everyone's going to know that you're my disciples by the love you have for one another. This is a supernatural love. This is a selfless love. This is not a natural love, is it? That's displayed. We talk about love in this society, but we don't really know what love is. This is agape love. And he says, when you show this kind of love, people are going to go, Christ. That's a disciple of Christ. By showing that kind of supernatural love. B.B. Warfield, the great theologian, self-sacrificing love is thus made the essence of the Christian life. For the sake of time, I was going to go through the life of Paul and show this. I just want to highlight a couple verses. Paul loved people like this. He followed the example of, he labored over the Galatians. Oh, you foolish Galatians, have I labored over you in vain? He talks about like a mother and a father. He loved the Thessalonians. Listen to these verses to Corinth. Now, think of the Corinthian church. Not an easy church to love, right? This church was jacked up. Paul had to go over and over. If he was looking strategically as a leader, would have left that church. They're not picking up on stuff. If he was motivated by success, if he was motivated by respect, get this. If he was motivated by respect, an apostle, the Corinthians allowed super apostles, as he called them sarcastically, to come in amongst them and defame Paul's reputation, and they believed them. They started looking down on Paul, going, yeah, you know what? What is Paul? Here Paul, imagine like this. You're at a church and you labor over them. And many of them are saved out of paganism through your ministry. I mean, lives transformed. And then you go. And people come in and start slandering you, and they turn on you and believe all the lies. You'd go, these people, right? Forget them. You guys kidding me? Not Paul. Listen to what he says, 2 Corinthians 7. I said before, you are in our hearts to die together and to live together. 2 Corinthians 12:14. Here, for the third time, listen to this, for the third time I'm ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours, the respect you can give me, the money you can give me, the fame you can give me, I don't want what's yours. I seek not what is yours, but you. Verse 15 of 2 Corinthians 12, I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? James Denny says this, commenting on this. This is one of the most movingly tender passages in the whole Bible. Not yours, but you is the motto of every minister who has learned of Christ. Isn't that good? I don't want what's yours, wife, children, employee. I want you. I don't want what you can give me. I want to win your heart to Christ. I want to love you and serve you. Isn't that good? Paul's motivation was out of a love for Jesus Christ, a love for the Corinthians. If he had been in it for anything else, he would have left a long time ago. Look, there's some good stuff here. Let me just see if I want to read. No, I'm just going to skip these examples real quick. I want to close with just a couple applicatory thoughts, okay? And then I know, Jonathan, you got to head out too in a few. Leadership motivated by love, the love of Christ toward you, your love toward Christ, and your love toward others, it creates leadership that lasts. Okay? And here's what I mean. And we could see it in the life of Paul, but it's not leadership that's hindered by how people respond. It's driven by something else altogether. If Paul had been driven by how people responded to him, he would have quit the Corinthian church and the Galatian church, right? They weren't responding right. But he was motivated by love, not by anything else. So listen to Oswald Chambers, and then I want to read you a really powerful example. Oswald Chambers says, the work of feeding and tending sheep is hard work, arduous work, and love for the sheep alone will not do it. You must have a consuming love for the great shepherd, the Lord Jesus Christ. Then he will flow through you in a passion of love and draw men to himself. You've got to be motivated by a love for God before even a love for people, okay? Otherwise, your motivation's not going to be good enough. Think of Moses with Israel. Remember, he was leading Israel from Egypt through the wilderness. You know how many times they picked up stones to stone him? You know how many times they said, forget us, let's get a new leader? Remember how many times they said, why'd you lead us out? If he had been in it for anything else other than the glory of God, he wouldn't have led them out of Egypt. Even before they got out of Egypt, they were complaining against him. He would have quit while he was ahead. Even when they worship the golden calf, he goes up to the mountain to God, and he says, your glory, God, your glory, your glory. He was driven by motivation for the love of God. So as difficult as things got, he never quit. You see that? This impacts your leadership. As difficult, she's not responding the way you want her to respond. The kids aren't buying in how you want them to buy in. The people at work, the people in church, etc. They're not buying in. They're making it difficult. They've done it again. If you're motivated by how they respond, you'll quit. But if you're motivated by the glory of God, you persevere. It's lasting, enduring leadership. And let me give you an awesome example of this. Paris Reedhead, back in the early 20th century, he says this in a sermon about missions. And it's a bit long, but just listen to this. Now I ask you, he says, what is the philosophy of mission? So here he's talking about the leadership of going and bringing Christ to the nations. What is the philosophy of evangelism? what is the philosophy of a Christian? And he went to Africa as a missionary. If you'll ask me why I went to Africa, I'll tell you I went primarily to improve on the justice of God. I didn't think it was right for anybody to go to hell without a chance to be saved. And so I went to give poor sinners a chance to go to heaven. Now, I hadn't put it in so many words, but if you'll analyze what I just told you, do you know what it is? It's humanism. But I was simply using the provisions of Jesus Christ as a means to improve upon human conditions of suffering and misery. What he's saying is my motivation was to improve on their conditions, to help them. That was my primary motivation, not God. And when I got to Africa, I discovered that they weren't poor, ignorant little heathen running around in the woods, waiting for and looking for someone to tell them how to go to heaven. They were monsters of sin. They were living in utter and total defiance of far more knowledge of God than I ever dreamed they had. They deserved hell because they utterly refused to walk in the light of their conscience and the light of the law written upon their heart and the testimony of nature and the truth they knew. And when I found that out, listen to this, I assure you, I was so angry with God that on one occasion in prayer, I told him that it was a mighty little thing he'd done, sending me out there to reach these people that were waiting to be told how to go to heaven. And when I got there, I found out they knew about heaven and didn't want to go there. And they loved their sin and wanted to stay in it. I went out there motivated by humanism. I'd seen pictures of lepers. I'd seen pictures of ulcers. I'd seen pictures of native funerals. And I didn't want my fellow human beings to suffer in hell eternally after such a miserable existence on earth. But it was there in Africa that God began to tear through the overlay of this humanism. And it was that day in my bedroom, with the door locked, that I wrestled with God. For here I was coming to grips with the fact that the people I thought were ignorant and wanted to know how to go to heaven and were saying, someone come and teach us, actually didn't want to take time to talk with me or anybody else. They had no interest in the Bible and no interest in Christ, and they loved their sin and wanted to continue in it. And I was to the place at that time where I felt the whole thing was a sham and a mockery, and I'd been sold a bill of goods, and I wanted to come home. Now listen to his conclusion. And there, alone in my bedroom, as I faced God honestly with what my heart felt, it seemed to me I heard him say, "Yes, will not the judge of all the earth do right? The heathen are lost, and they're going to hell, not because they haven't heard the gospel. They're going to hell because they are sinners who loved their sin and because they deserved hell. But I didn't send you out there for them. I didn't send you out there for their sakes." And I heard as clearly as I've ever heard, though it wasn't with physical voice, but it was the echo of the truth of the ages finding its way into an open heart. I heard God say to my heart that day something like this: I didn't send you to Africa for the sake of the heathen. I sent you to Africa for my sake. They deserved hell, but I loved them, and I endured the agonies of hell for them. I didn't send you out there for them. I sent you out there for me. Do I not deserve the reward of my suffering? Don't I deserve those for whom I died? And Paris Reedhead says, and it reversed it all. It changed it all. And it righted it all. And I wasn't any longer working for my cup and 10 shekels and a t-shirt, but I was serving the living God. Isn't that amazing? He says, I went out there motivated to help my fellow man. And I realized they didn't want my help. So I wanted to go home. What are you motivated for in your leadership? To help the people you're leading, primarily? Paris Reedhead realized God sent me there for him, for his glory, because he died for his love, motivated by what he'd done for me, what he'd done for them. I went there for Christ. I didn't go there for them. And so he stayed and he labored, regardless of whether they spit on him, regardless of whether they slapped him, regardless of whether they hated him. He was there primarily motivated for love of God. Does that make sense? You go to the mission field because you see children starving, you'll leave in 6 months. Because those kids will two-time you and spit in your face. You go to the mission field because God sent his son to die for them, and you'll stay there for years. Look at that, the missionaries in the Middle East. Look at our friends in Lebanon. They're not winning prizes, but they're there, regardless if people accept them, because they're motivated by the love for God. Does that make sense? And leadership motivated by love for God creates a God-centered leadership that is concerned with his glory, his honor, not your own. You go in there motivated for... If I pastor this church motivated for my success, my reputation, I won't love you. I'll love what you can give me. Oh, more people are coming. My reputation's getting boosted. Oh, the church is growing. I must look better. Great. I don't care about you. I care about the fact that you're a number in the pew and your money in the box. It's motivated by me. But if I'm motivated to pastor this church because of what Christ has done for me, I love him so much. Therefore, I've got to love him and be an ambassador for him. And I love people so much because he died for them that I'm here to serve you, to lay down my life for you. And it doesn't matter if you turn, leave, struggle, are difficult, right? So, I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I hope it's clear. Any thoughts or anything on that? The right motivation of a leader.